We are in chapter 8 of Mark. Last week we were talking about one of the main points at the end was about how Jesus sees people as people, not projects. And we're really going to continue on in that kind of story and that theme today. And what we're going to see is there's really four things that we're going to look at. We're going to look at how Jesus is compassion, how Jesus is a sign, how Jesus heals physically, and the fourth thing, how he heals spiritually. And what it's all going to point to is how Jesus had compassion with the disciples to lead them in this and teach them how to know him on a deeper level and how to enter into a relationship with him. And so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at, is how Jesus guided the disciples in that. So our first section, Jesus is compassion. That's verses 1 through 10. We're going to go ahead and read that now. It says, "In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him, and he said to them, I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar." Then his disciples answered him, "How can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness?" He asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and he gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to eat before them. And they set before them, before the multitude, they also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Immediately he got into the boat with his disciples, and he came to the region of Dalmanutha. So what we see here in this first section is that Jesus is compassion. That is one of his characteristics. That is who he is. And there's a couple things that I want to talk about, right? We mentioned how Jesus views people as people and not projects. And here is kind of proof of that, right? He not only, when he sees them as people, not projects, he's able to correctly diagnose their need, right? What was their need? The people had been with him for 3 days. They had been listening to him teach, and they now were hungry. And that was the need. They were hungry, and if they left, the problem was that they would probably faint on the way home because they had a long ways to go. And so we see here, Jesus identifies their problem. They are hungry, right? This is not a very spiritual problem. It's a very practical problem. And I think that this is something as Christians in church we struggle with, especially as pastors and men. We struggle with the idea that problems can be practical, right? We always think this practical problem needs a spiritual answer. And sometimes there is a spiritual truth within that answer and whatnot. But more than not, in this case, it was a very practical problem that needed a practical solution. What was the solution to their hunger? They would eat. They needed food, right? And so one thing I've noticed is that when we see people as projects and we see situations and we think to ourselves, we need to fix this problem, we sometimes, misdiagnose the problem in the beginning. And we see it as this spiritual issue, or we misunderstand the problem at hand. But the reality of it is that God has called us to walk with him in his solution, right? The disciples were not needed to come up with the solution. Jesus didn't ask them to, you guys go figure it out. I'm going to go over here and watch you guys and see if you can figure it out. No. What he said is, how much food do you have? Let me be the one to do the work. Let me be the one to bring forth the miracle. You see, he did what only he could do. The disciples couldn't do a miracle. They were not the ones that could perform that. Just like we are not the ones that we cannot perform the miracles, right? It's God working through us to do these things. But the reality of it is that Jesus is the one who has to do the work. And even though they had just fed 5,000 with this literal same method before this, that Jesus still wanted the disciples to be a part of it, right? He still had compassion on them. He still wanted to use them in what little capacity they could, because at this point, about all they could do was eat the food themselves and pass it out and collect the leftovers. And so what we see here is that Jesus still wants to use the disciples to accomplish his goal. And it's a really comforting thing because it shows us that, hey, we don't have to find the answer by ourselves, A. And B, Jesus is still going to use us in his solution. The next thing we see here is that not only does Jesus ask them to partake and ask them to help, but he doesn't feed these people till they're just not hungry, but he completely satisfies the people's hunger. Right? He goes to the point where they are full, where they are fully satisfied. Right? The idea here as well is that not only does he go to their fully satisfied, but he provides abundantly more. Right? They had 5 or 7 baskets full of leftovers. And what's interesting is these aren't like laundry baskets, like medium size. No, the same word here is used when they describe in other passages like a man being let down in a basket out of a house. We're talking a big, thick wicker basket, like something tall. So we're talking 7 big baskets equivalent to maybe 14 smaller size baskets. And so he abundantly takes care of people, right? He provided more than they could possibly need so that they can continue to be full at the end. And I think this is has some good application for us, because sometimes when the Lord uses us to minister to people and to bless people, whether it's praying for them, talking to them, understanding, listening, that the Lord in turn fills them up to the point where they are so full that they are overflowing with his grace, and they go out and they share that with other people. And so we just see this this beautiful picture of how even in their ignorance, in their misunderstanding, and their missing the mark, Jesus is still using his disciples right now. And we've seen that time and time again in the Gospels, that Jesus is still using his people. And so they feed those people, they fill up their bags with all the leftovers, and they get on a boat and they get out of town. All right, so send people home, job's done there, we're moving on. And we get to this section here where the Pharisees show up on the scene, and we're going to see an interesting dialogue between Jesus and the Pharisees, and then how Jesus uses that dialogue to try to teach the disciples something, but again, they completely miss it. And so that is in verses 11 through 21. And it says, "Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, or to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, 'Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation.' And he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, 'Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.' And they reasoned among themselves, saying, 'Is it because we have no bread?' But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, 'Why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketful of fragments did you take up?' They said to him, 12. 'Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up?' He said, 7. And he said to them, 'How is it that you do not understand?'" So the first thing that happens, right, the Pharisees show up on the scene, and they are not here they're not there with the right heart, right? They're not actually there to learn more about Jesus, to understand him better. They're here to test him, right? And what do they ask for? They ask for a sign. Now, I want to point out there is a difference between a miracle and a sign in biblical context here, right? A miracle is something that's done on the basis of faith in Jesus. A sign is something when you have no faith in Jesus, right? The disciples and the people in that time would go to Jesus and ask for miracles to be done with the people in the area. And Jesus would answer them, and he would do those miracles a lot of the time. But those people were coming in faith that he could do those things. They truly believed that Jesus could perform those miracles. They might not have fully understood. In fact, they didn't fully understand who he was, but they understood that he could do those miracles. That is faith. The signs that the Pharisees are asking for would be something like fire out of heaven, something that would prove to them, right? Because they had no faith, they needed proof that Jesus was sent from God and was the right person to complete the mission. Now, what they missed was that Jesus was the sign that God sent in order to save humanity, right? It would be like praying for, if you're really hungry and you pray to God, Lord, I need food. And then you're sitting there hanging out and your spouse comes and brings you a plate of food and says, hey, I made you lunch. And then you, instead of eating it, you just are like, Lord, is this really the food that is this true? Prove to me that this is the food that I need to be full. It's silly. It's ridiculous. But that is kind of the heart that these people had. All right? And so Jesus says that they're not going to get a sign. In Matthew 16, verse 4, he says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to him except for the sign of the prophet of Jonah. And then he left them and departed, right? Jonah was the sign they'd already got, going into the belly and coming back out 3 days later. That was the sign that they had already received. And so, why? Why don't they get another sign? Well, Jesus was the sign that they were given. They were talking to the very person that Jesus had sent them to show them of these things. And they missed the point. The Pharisees were missing the mark. They viewed Jesus as a prophet or maybe as Elijah, they didn't view him as the Messiah because their idea of what the Messiah would look like was different. And then I love this. This is probably my favorite verse in the whole thing, but Jesus is trying to tell the disciples and warn them of how this mindset, this worldly way of thinking can affect their ministry, really, is what he was doing. And they just respond to him when he brings up the leaven. They're like, is it because we don't have any bread on the ship? And it's like if you've ever had a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old, and you're talking to that 2-year-old, and every 2 and 3-year-old, they have trigger words. If I say juice or milk, Ezra is going to take that conversation and run with it the other way, and he's not going to stop talking until I give him juice or milk. Right? It's like they have this trigger word in their mind, and they're gone. They're off on another, and you're not getting them back. You don't have control of that conversation anymore. And that's what it's like with the disciples. It's like this trigger word. They're like, bread? We don't have bread. He must be saying this because we don't have bread. Somehow the Pharisees and Herod have to do with us not having bread. And I like how they're when they're talking about it, it's like they're pondering this question. Like they don't even understand how this could even make sense. And so Jesus compassionately rebukes them, or it's less of a rebuke and more of an appeal, right? He asks them this simple question, do you not understand? And what he's really asking them is, do you not understand who I am? The question is not, do you understand this conversation we're trying to have? This question is, do you not understand who I am right now? And better yet, do you not understand why I'm with you guys right now? And there's 3 levels that Jesus rebukes these men on. And the first is he mentions hardened hearts, eyes that do not see, ears that do not hear, and then just simply minds that do not remember. Right? This could be a whole sermon, and you could go into each one of these, and you can see how these four things correlate with a bunch of miracles that Jesus has already done. Could be great. We don't have the time for that. So to look at the big picture of this, what he's really saying is, how can you not remember the goodness of God? How can you not remember what I've already done for you? Oftentimes, we get into issues, we have things that pop up in our lives, hardships, heartaches, and we go into panic mode, and we're like, what do I do? What can I do? Who do I need to call? Who should this? Who should? And what in reality we need to do is stop and remember that God isn't asking you to do anything, but in reality, he's just asking you to, in faith, remember what he's done, and in faith, ask him to do that very thing again. See, God wasn't asking the disciples to ever fix any of this problem. He was just asking them to partner with him. It's the same with us. It's so easy for us to want to fix things. And we get in this mindset of fix, when really we need to be in a mindset of listen. And to truly listen means that you're not trying to fix things, and you're allowing the Word of God to speak to you. Maybe you have a journal where you write down prayer requests that were answered. Or you just have a journal where you know, man, the Lord really spoke to me and did this for me today. That was cool. And then when you're in times of hardship, you can go back to that journal and you'll be like, wow, if he was faithful to do it for this big thing, then this small issue that I have right now, this is no problem for him. This is a piece of cake. Psalm 77:11 says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. We need to remember the wonders that the Lord has done for us. Whether it's salvation, whether it's miracles. And if we do that, it allows us to have the correct perspective when we're facing trials. A lot of people have family members that maybe aren't saved, and you're like, man, they just don't get it. They're never going to get it. But if you just remember that you were once in that spot, you're like, man, if he can save me, we're good. Like, we're looking good. This person's better off than I am. And so what we see here is that simply allowing the Lord to stir up in us a remembrance of the things he's done allows him to continue to bless us in those ways. We're entering a part of this chapter now where transitionary period takes place. So this book kind of shifts. Jesus is about to reveal things to the disciples that he hadn't yet revealed. And so this book is kind of shifting from when Jesus was talking like in parables and bringing things like that and working in kind of a secretive way. And now it's shifting to a more open conversation of, hey, this is my plan. I am, as the Son of Man, going to die. And it's shifting more towards Jesus's quest or his journey to Jerusalem, to the cross. And we're starting to get in kind of a different section. And what we're going to see here is this specific verse in verses 22 through 26 is it foreshadows what's to come. And so let's read that now. It says in verse 22, then he came to Bethsaida, and then they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up, and he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell anyone in town. So this pretty straightforward passage, right? They get to this town. Friends bring out a friend who's blind, ask Jesus to heal him. Jesus partially heals him and then fully heals him, and then they're on their way. A couple things that I think are important to understand. The idea is not that Jesus messed up the first time. It's not like, oh, I only partially healed you. Whoops, wrong thing. Let me do that again. All right. The idea is that for whatever reason, Jesus felt it necessary to partially heal this man and then fully heal his eyesight. And that's the foreshadowing that I was talking about, right? The disciples right now are in that stage where they're partially can see. They have partial blindness still towards Jesus. They don't fully understand who Jesus is. And what's going to happen is Jesus is going to have to now, and he's getting ready to fully heal, fully reveal himself to the disciples in a spiritual way. And we can sometimes be in that same area where sometimes we're in a season of we're partially like we can't really see the big picture of what's happening. There's a lot of ways this could apply, but we don't necessarily see the big picture of what God's doing. Maybe we only see a little bit. And there will be a point in those seasons where the Lord fully reveals those things. And now you're like, oh, now it makes sense why he was doing what he was doing. But for our case, this is a very foreshadowing portion of the story that's pointing to what Jesus is going to do next. In this next section, we're going to see how Jesus heals the disciples spiritually, the spiritually blind. And there's three things we're going to look at. The first thing is in verses 27 through 30. It says here, now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, who do men say that I am? So he answered, John the Baptist. So they answered, John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him and said to him, you are the Christ. Then he strictly warned them, telling them that they should tell no one about him. So, this is what I mean by partially blind, right? The disciples, through Peter was kind of their spokesman. I just kind of imagine like the disciples were afraid to talk to Jesus a little bit. And so they're like, which one of us is dumb enough to be the mouth? Peter, you got the job. That's you. You're the spokesperson for us. And that's kind of what Peter's role is. So Peter says, you are the Christ. So they had it partially revealed to them through the parables, telling them that Jesus was the Christ. But as we're going to see in the next chapter, they really didn't fully understand what that meant. And in Matthew 16:17, it says, Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So we understand that this wasn't even necessarily fully them who understood this, but it was God revealing it through them, right? God revealed it to Peter and the disciples who Jesus was. And that's a beautiful thing, but we're going to see in this next section that sometimes we can be in one moment hearing from God perfectly, but the next we can be a mouthpiece to Satan. In verse 31 through 33 it says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. What we see here is that they really were still partially blind at this moment. They understood, but when they heard of the suffering that Jesus was going to have to partake in, they immediately denied it. And they immediately said, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to suffer. And let's not give Peter too flack here because, again, he's the spokesperson. And when Jesus rebukes them, he turns to all of them to rebuke them. But this was a foreign idea, right? They believed that the Messiah would be one that came down and he would immediately kick Rome out and take over. And that they would rule with him in this glorious state of Jesus the King. But what they didn't understand, and what Peter ignorantly rebuked Jesus for, was the fact that the Son of Man needed to first suffer and die so that they could even take part in the kingdom. Because if he had just came down then, sin was not forgiven. They would not have been able to take part in the kingdom. He had not made it to the cross yet. And he mentions here, you are mindful, for you are mindful of the things of, not of the things of God, but of the things of men. That's a very worldly way of thinking. When we forget to think about the cross, when we forget to think about what Jesus has done for us, we enter into that kind of worldly way of thinking. You see, Satan offers glory without suffering, but God's way is suffering transformed into glory. And I think that's really, really important to understand. Satan offers glory without suffering. God's way is suffering transformed into glory. Right? What that doesn't necessarily mean is that we're going to be always suffering and we're going to always be miserable. What that means, though, is for Jesus in this instance that he had to first suffer before there could be glory. And that is, in a sense, where we're at now. One day Jesus will return in all his glory, and it'll be great. But right now there's suffering in the world. We have to deal with these things of the world that we won't have to deal with. And I think more this applies in our day-to-day lives, right? How many times are we struggling with something that we're not willing to suffer through not having something in order that we might have glory later? That's Satan's MO. He tells you, hey, just do this and you'll have awesome stuff now. You'll have glory now. But the reality of it is what he doesn't tell you is the suffering that will come later. The other part of this is that Jesus, at some point, every single person is going to answer that question that Jesus asked the disciples, who am I? And the ones who chose glory instead of suffering for the cross, those are the ones that Jesus is going to say, depart from me, I never knew you. The ones that chose the world over Jesus. And those are the things that he's revealing to his disciples right now, is that we all have to make that decision at some point. We all do. No one is exempt from making that decision. See, Jesus didn't care what other people thought about him. Jesus doesn't care what the people around you, what they call him. He cares what you call him. He cares if you know. Obviously, he cares about those people, but the idea is that he is so focused on people that he can just care about just you in that very moment and the other person. And that's what he's saying is, hey, who am I? That's the question he's asking. This question can be both practical in the sense of in any scenario that you might run into, God is saying, hey, yeah, you have this issue that popped up, but who am I? Right? A reminder, what have I done for you already? And it can also be in sense of a new believer or somebody who doesn't believe, a family member, a loved one, right? They need to answer that question, who am I? And the third thing we're going to look at is kind of how Jesus gives his first invite to follow him. It's his first openly stated thing. Everything he said, as we remember, was in parables. When he would do things, he would give them in parables. And this is the first time it even says here in the Word that it was an open invite. In verse 34 to verse 1 of chapter 9, it says, that when he had called the people to himself, with his disciples also, he spoke to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And he said to them, assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power. Again, this could be its whole message. You could spend all your time in this one thing. And I encourage you guys, go back this week. Go back and really dive into stuff. There's some really cool parallels between other instances, miracles that Jesus did. It's very rich. But for our sake today, the big picture here is that the way of the cross is not easy, but it's worth it. There's this quote by I couldn't find the name of the guy, but the quote is, "You'll never live until you walk down death row with Jesus." You will never live until you walk down death row with Jesus. And I love that quote because I think it really hits this whole portion, hits all of this. Because you read that and you're like, I don't like that. I don't want that. But then if you really take time to understand what Jesus is saying, in all of these, in all his invites to become a disciple, and all the things you have to do, the main point is that he doesn't want you to do it alone. Right? The way of the world, you do it alone. You're the guy or gal. You're it. But the invite he's giving here, it is with him. He's inviting us into relationship with him, and then he is the one doing the heavy work. Right? You'll never live until you walk down the death row with Jesus. That's the key, with Jesus. In all of this, it's about walking with Jesus. He's teaching the disciples in this to walk with him. And the beautiful thing about this is we don't have to do it ourselves. There are so many people that try to walk life by themselves. There's Christians who try to walk life by themselves, and it doesn't work. And that's two-part, because we need to be in fellowship with one another, because that's how we lift each other up and encourage each other. We share our burdens with one another. But more importantly, and most importantly, it's with Jesus. These things that he says seem harsh and unfair. But the reality of it is he's inviting us into something that is unfair. It was unfair for him. Right? He's the one who had to die. We don't have to. That's what he's inviting us to. We sit here and we're like, that's just not fair, that we have to lose our life to gain it. That just doesn't. But the reality of it is he's the one who lost his life so that we could gain ours. He's the one who went to the cross for our sin. When we start to understand the things that Jesus says is less of, you have to do these things, and more of, join me in life, we understand that it's easier that way. We join in Christ so that he can minister to us. And then now all the problems that arise, all the issues that come up, it doesn't matter. Because we now see it as, wow, the Lord just wants to show me even more faithfulness. He wants to partner with me again. How crazy is that? And we begin to understand that Jesus had to suffer. The disciples begin to understand that Jesus had to suffer first so that they could walk with him forever. Right? It wasn't Jesus' job. He wasn't the one who was going to lead the early church. Right? Jesus had to leave so someone greater than him could come, and that was the Holy Spirit. And that's this beautiful picture of Jesus could have gone and he could have been a preacher who's like, yes, be saved, this, that. But he knew his role, and his role wasn't necessarily to be that. His role was to die. That was his role. He came and he did that. And then his role was to rise again and then send into heaven. And then the Holy Spirit came down. And then the disciples started doing life with one another, started doing church. And thousands of people were saved because Jesus was obedient to God. Instead of being obedient to Satan, Satan offered him glory without suffering. But Jesus knew that God's way was suffering transformed into glory. And that's what he has for us. We don't look at our struggles and hardships as being punished. We don't look at these bad things as, wow, we're in trouble. We look at them as ways that the Lord is growing us and inviting us into his solutions for our daily life. And when we truly look at those things like that, we start to see the Bible in a whole other light. It's not just a book we read, but it's God's word breathed out. This is how you hear. And when we view it like that, now it has power. If we just view it as a chore, it'll still work. But when we truly view it the way God intended it to be viewed, now there's some power. And now we have a leg to stand on, in the sense that when people come after us and hardships come our way, we have a rock to stand on. And it's this really beautiful thing that we realize, wow, life with Jesus is easy because he carries our burdens.